so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my December wrap-up. So December was a slightly weird reading month for me. I have 12 things to talk to you about today, but I realised while making my list for filming this video that I only read actually one novel this month, but I did read quite a few short stories and short story collections and poetry collections and non-fiction, so quite a varied month, and let's get into the books. To start off, as usual, with the classics. The one novel I did read in December was The Last Chronicle of Barset by Anthony Trollope. This is the last book in the Chronicles of Barchester series by Anthony Trollope, which I've been reading over the last 2 years, I suppose. If you don't know, the Chronicles of Barchester are a Victorian series of novels by Anthony Trollope, all set in the mythical county, the fictional county of Barsetshire. They're not so much sort of direct sequels to one another, but they have many characters that crop up in each other's books, and they're all set roughly in the same place, so there is some crossover between them. It's more like a series of 6 interlinking novels than it is a direct series, and in The Last Chronicle we get to meet a lot of characters that have turned up in previous novels and revisit them again. I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed this. It was absolutely wonderful and one of my real highlights of the year. I've loved the whole of the Chronicles of Barsetshire, and although the last book is not my favourite, the last book was what I wanted it to be and fully met my expectations of being wonderful. The central plotline of it follows a family that we've encountered in a previous Barchester novel, and the father of this family, who is a clergyman, is accused of stealing a cheque of £20. The book explores how this affects the man's physical and mental health, and also how it affects the lives of his family and those around him, and then there are several other subplots which feature various other characters, some of which are entirely new for this book and some of which you've encountered before in the previous Chronicles of Barchester. One of the things I quite like about Anthony Trollope is that his plots can be unconventional and unpredictable, and there were times in this book when I was on the edge of my seat and I really didn't know how particular subplots or plots were going to go, and I feel like Trollope did everything correct in this book. There were no decisions in this book that he made that I didn't want him to make, and there were some decisions that I really thought he was going to make in a way I didn't want him to, and then he didn't, and I was very happy. So I should have trusted Anthony Trollope more. It was an absolutely brilliant book, and I would highly recommend The Chronicles of Barchester if you haven't yet picked them up. Another classic I read in December was His Last Bow by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the penultimate Sherlock Holmes short story collection, and one that I thoroughly enjoyed. What I found reading Sherlock Holmes over the last year, or listening to Sherlock Holmes on audiobook, the Stephen Fry audiobooks in fact, which are very good, what I've noticed is that I don't particularly like the Sherlock Holmes novels very much, with the exception of Hound of the Baskervilles. The other 3 I'm not very fussed by at all, but the short story collections I do love a lot and I find thoroughly enjoyable. Nick and I are just finishing up listening to the very last Sherlock Holmes short story collection at the moment on audiobook, and then I will be done. I'll have read all of Sherlock Holmes, which is quite fun because I do really enjoy them. And yeah, this was a very enjoyable short story collection, as I found with most of the short story collections there. And now on to some Christmas classics. Me and Kate Howe and Carolyn from Carolyn's Reading Rambles decided to read a few Christmassy Victorian things over the Christmas season. So I'm sorry, I know like Christmas is gone now and you're probably not feeling as Christmassy as you were if I'd have told you about these books a little while ago. Nonetheless, I do have a few Christmassy stories, novellas and short story collections to talk about. First is Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. This is the new Vintage Classics edition of A Christmas Carol, which they very kindly sent me for review, and I'll link down my full video on A Christmas Carol below. Suffice to say, I love A Christmas Carol very much. I've read it a couple of times and always thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was a real joy to reread it this December. I'm sure you all know about A Christmas Carol. It is one of Charles Dickens's Christmas books or Christmas novellas, and we follow a man called Scrooge who is not very nice, a bit miserly, a bit selfish, and is visited by 4 ghosts on Christmas Eve to show him that perhaps he ought to lead a better life in the future. It's beautiful and enjoyable and I love it very much. I then read The Twilight Stories, or Tales for Christmas Eve by Rhoda Broughton. Rhoda Broughton is a Welsh Victorian author that I've been meaning to read for a while. I spoke about her in Victober and tried to read something by her then and didn't get around to it, so it was nice to read something by her this time. Somebody recommended The Twilight Stories for me in the comments for this channel and said that they were originally written for Christmas, so I thought I'd check them out. However, I do have to confess that I didn't especially like them very much. Mostly, I think I was expecting them to be Christmassy and they weren't. They were originally published under the name Tales for Christmas Eve, but none of the stories were remotely Christmassy. They're all ghost stories, which is why they were published as sort of Tales for Christmas Eve, because there was this kind of sort of Victorian idea that ghosts were in some way Christmassy, as you often see. A lot of Dickens's Christmas stories are ghostly as well. And I just found all of the ghost stories very unbelievable and therefore not scary, but I think they were supposed to be scary. Not like A Christmas Carol where it's about ghosts, but obviously it's not supposed to be horror. Whereas I feel like the Twilight stories were trying to be frightening, and I didn't find them very frightening because they were all so thoroughly unbelievable. I kind of enjoyed reading it. I liked her writing a lot, so I definitely like to read something by Rhoda Broughton in the future, but I think in looking at her stuff in the future, I will make sure I read something realist by her and not anything supernatural, because I found the supernatural stuff not very believable. But anyway, there we go. Moving on to the next book. Another Christmas short story collection I read this year was this classic, which is Christmas at Thompson Hall and Other Stories by Anthony Trollope. I love Anthony Trollope very, very much, as I said at the beginning of this video, and I really, really enjoyed reading his Christmas stories. The Christmas stories in here are very, very funny. Some of them are sort of love stories, some of them are stories about families and sort of minor embarrassments. They're very, very comic, a lot of them, but some of them are also quite moving. There's one story which is about two generals in the American Civil War who are on kind of different sides, and I thought that was quite interesting. Especially to see sort of Anthony Trollope's perspective on the conflict at the time. I think my favourite story in the collection though is probably the title story, Christmas at Thompson Hall, where a woman goes back into her hotel room thinking it's her husband and accidentally finds herself in another man's room, and very many comic things ensue. It's very, very good fun, and yes, I'd highly recommend it, probably for next Christmas, but a very enjoyable read. And then I read two individual Christmas short stories by two different Victorian authors. The first one I read was The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde, which, again, a bit like Twilight stories by Rhoda Broughton, was not actually as Christmassy as I was expecting. In fact, I would probably say that The Selfish Giant is more of like an Easter story, although it has appeared in collections of Christmas stories, and I think possibly it must have been written or published around Christmas to begin with. The Selfish Giant is a very short story about a selfish giant, and it is sort of a cross between a fable and a kind of religious parable. I didn't get that much out of it, to be honest, possibly because it was so short and possibly because I'm not religious, but yes, not especially one for me. But moving on to the next Christmas story, which was Christmas Storms and Sunshine by Elizabeth Gaskell, which I adored. This was one of my favourite things I read in December. It was absolutely wonderful and just made me smile so much. It is exactly everything I want in a Christmas story, I think. About these two couples who live in the same lodging house, and the husband of one works for the sort of Tory newspaper in the town, and the husband of the other works for the Liberal newspaper in the town, and so these families hate each other vehemently. And then one Christmas, the baby of one of the families gets sick and everything kind of goes on from there, and it's just like people coming together and overcoming their differences at Christmas, and it is beautiful and lovely and made me like smile and slightly cry, even though it's quite a short story. So next Christmas, definitely read Christmas Storms and Sunshine by Elizabeth Gaskell. It's very, very brilliant. And then in December I read 3 poetry collections, which is slightly odd because in the whole of 2017 I only read 4 poetry collections and 3 of them were in December, but there we go. 2 of them were collections of Christmas poems. There's this, which is an anthology of Christmas poems, one of the Everyman editions, and this, which is Christmas poems by Yue Fanthorpe. Nick and I did a video talking about our favourite Christmas poems where we did talk about these 2 books a little bit, but I also wanted to talk about them here as well. I loved the Christmas poems by Yue Fanthorpe. Yue Fanthorpe is one of my favourite poets. I discovered her when I was about 15 and I really, really enjoy her poetry. I did read one of her poems in the other video, so I won't read one now, but I really enjoy her way with words, I enjoy her humour, I enjoy the images she creates, and I think she is a wonderful, wonderful poet. All of the poems in here were originally sent by her on Christmas cards to various friends during her life, which I think is really, really lovely. So yes, I would definitely recommend this one, again, maybe next Christmas. The other poetry anthology, the Christmas poems from Everyman Classics, I didn't like that much, and I liked a lot less than the Yue Fanthorpe collection. Partly because I found most of these poems to be quite samey. I found them all to be quite similar, and I kind of wish it had been a bit more of a kind of diverse mix of Christmas poems. There were a lot of nativity poems, as me and Nick spoke about in the video. The majority of these poems, with a couple of exceptions, are religious poetry, which is fine because obviously Christmas is a religious festival, but I think because Christmas does mean a lot of different things to different people, it would have been very nice, I think, to have had a bit more variation in this, especially because it's not just that they're all religious poems, but a lot of them are nativity poems and poems about the Christmas story rather than about sort of modern interpretations of Christmas or reinterpretations of Christmas and Christmas traditions and family and so on, and so I just think it wasn't really for me. And the other poetry collection I read in December was So Glad I'm Me by Roddy Lumsden. The observant amongst you may notice from Twitter and Instagram and so on that my name is also Lumsden. Roddy is my uncle, and this is his 10th poetry collection, I think, and it's been shortlisted for this year's T.S. Eliot Prize, which is quite exciting, and the results should be announced in a week or 2, I think. I haven't read all of his collections. I think I've probably read about half of them, and I would say this is one of my favourites so far. If you haven't read much poetry, I wouldn't say that his poetry is a great place to start with poetry. It's not very, very accessible, but I would say that this collection is probably the most accessible of the ones that I've read so far, and I did really enjoy this one. There were a couple of poems that I really, really loved. I really loved the poems Autism and False Flag / Khaki, and one of my favourites was Ashna Saka, aged 5, which I think I will read for you now. Ashna Saka, aged 5, on her first bike. To rule the universe is not enough. To mow down some pigeons, then rule the show might do. To be Ramesses would work. Ramesses, Evita and Genghis, and Joan d'Arc and perhaps St. Columba too. Determined. Get off her pavement. Learn the rules. Who rules? The helmet's a rouge, she'd never fall. The battling star of this, the all. Sandals carambering, Power Ranger peddling. A small big bang, a cosmic blur. She's halfway up Ermine Street. The burn of all future is on her, and she rings the bell, drops one paw from the handlebar, salutes and sings the national anthem of herself. I then read 2 non-fiction books in December, both of which were sent to me by Pen and Swords for review. The first is this, which is Dickens and Christmas by Lucinda Hawksley, which was a really enjoyable read and quite an interesting one. Lucinda Hawksley is actually a descendant of Dickens, which is quite interesting, and this is, as the title suggests, a book about Dickens and Christmas. But it's not just about A Christmas Carol, it's about all the other Christmas books that he wrote and also the sort of Christmas editions of magazines that he produced in later life. I really, really enjoyed this one, and I thought it was an excellent read. I especially think I enjoyed the second half of the book, sort of from when Dickens writes A Christmas Carol onwards. One thing that's quite interesting in this book is that it's sort of half a biography of Dickens and half a history of Victorian Christmas. And I felt like in the first half those different aspects didn't always meet together, but in the second half, where Lucinda Hawksley talks a lot about the way that Christmas affected his writing and the fact that he put so much work into the Christmas edition of the magazine he ran that he spent like half of his year thinking about Christmas, I thought that brought the sort of 2 halves of the book together really, really well, and I really, really enjoyed this, and I would definitely recommend it. Again, probably next Christmas, but it is certainly worth a read. But the other non-fiction book I read this month was a real favourite with me and an absolutely wonderful, wonderful read, and one I cannot recommend enough. Elegant Etiquette in the 19th Century by Mallory James. You know when you read a book and you feel like it's been kind of written expressly for you? I'm not saying that Mallory James just wrote this book to help me with my historical fiction writing, but it does feel a little bit like that, because this book was like so many things that I wanted and so many things that I needed. Literally, I started reading this book and the first chapter is all about a thing that I spent like an hour Googling like 2 days before for the historical fiction book that I've been writing set in the Victorian period. I loved it a lot. It is about etiquette in the 19th century, as it suggests, and it's really nice actually that it is about the 19th century and not just the Victorian period, because it's nice to kind of see changes from sort of Jane Austen's time up to the time of Oscar Wilde. And one of the things I really loved about this book is that it talks a lot about changes over the 19th century, and it talks a lot about the difference between rural and urban society and customs, which is something that I really, really love and I think is often lacking from books that talk about the 19th century. I spoke about this when I reviewed The Victorian House by Judith Flanders in my November wrap-up, and how, although I'd really enjoyed the book, it didn't really talk very much about the differences between urban and rural, and also between like the start and end of the Victorian period, and I love that this book addressed this very, very much. And it's one of those books that was not only like educational, and I feel like I learned a lot about the 19th century, a lot that will inform my writing and also my reading in terms of things that I will understand a bit more, and I can understand sort of the social slights more in Victorian novels, which sometimes you miss if you don't know the particular etiquette of the time. But also it was such an enjoyable and easy read. It's written with such a sense of fun. I can tell that Mallory James really, really enjoyed writing this, and I certainly enjoyed reading it. So I would absolutely definitely recommend this book. As you can see, I tabbed it to death, and it was just an absolutely wonderful read. Thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyable book, and one of my favourites of the year. I think that's a good place to finish my December wrap-up. Those are all of the things that I read in December. A slightly different month for me, with more poetry and non-fiction than usual and a lot less novels. But regardless, I think it was a fairly good reading month, and I'm looking forward to what January will bring. So thank you very much for watching. Let me know down in the comments what you read in December, and if you read any great Christmassy reads, especially if you have any other recommendations of Victorian Christmas stories or books, because I do always thoroughly enjoy them. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.